Expansion was not just European, not just American, but it was also clear in East Asia as well. For Japan, after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, had become a regional powerhouse with an army trained by Prussian officers, a respectable, in fact increasingly large and very powerful navy modeled on a British navy. Well, why emulate any other navy if it's not going to be the Royal Navy? And this is an image of a set of hot balloons that the Japanese Navy set off in the port of Edo. The Japanese Navy had acquired 12 modern warships, though not yet the battleships that would become so famous in the 1890s. But like Europe, like the United States, Japan was looking beyond its boundaries for new colonies, both symbolically and in search of security. For one Prussian advisor, let's just go back to the map so you can see how this worked. One Prussian military advisor noted to his Japanese colleagues that Korea, quote, resembled a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. Now, Korea was a tributary state in Beijing's orbit, but the Japanese saw Korea as an opportunity to secure territories for primary product production for Japanese imports to Japan. So food production in Korea and Taiwan, which would then become renamed Formosa, the production of grains in Manchuria. Increasingly, as the Japanese drew commodities from these areas that had been more oriented towards the political orbit of Beijing, now Japan was on a collision course with China. Now, China had a very large army and a large navy. In this sense, China is very different from the Europeans looking at Africa because they didn't face the same kind of military opposition. And of course, very different from the ways in which the United States spanked Spain in the Philippines and in Cuba. No, this time Japan had to go up against a mighty, traditional, powerful neighbor. But its armies and its navies were antiquated. There was poor morale. The Chinese state simply could not field the modern kinds of weaponry and tactics that the Japanese had trained themselves in. A completely broken chain of command within the Chinese military. So when war finally erupted in 1894, China was quickly trounced. Most of China's fleet was sunk, and so it was all but impossible for the Chinese to hang on to the Korean peninsula. There was, nonetheless, an important series of atrocities that were committed by Japanese troops who looked upon the Chinese and the Koreans as racially inferior. Again, notice how race gets tied into imperial expansion. At Port Arthur in Manchuria, a very important massacre took place in November of 1894, in which Japanese troops wiped out some 6,000 soldiers and civilians, leaving only 36 survivors left behind to bury the cadavers of the dead. So these scenes of massacre, we're going to see this happen more and more, are part and parcel of the models of imperial expansion. This was deeply humiliating to the Qing authorities in China. Witnessing the arrival of Japanese power on a world stage, as Korea would become then a dependency of Japan and later would be annexed to Japan. The treaty that China was forced to sign declared that the Japanese had rights to trade all the way up the Yangtze River. And the settlement decided that China had to make very onerous indemnity payments to the victor. It was also, I might add, one of the first filmed wars. In any event, this struggle was by no means the end of the story in the Northeast Asian theater. And it was not over in the 1890s. For the arrival of Japan destabilized the whole balance of forces in East Asia generally. It required that, or rather compelled the Russians to intensify their race towards the Pacific so that the Russians could thwart Japanese advancement. For Russia, too, had designs on the Pacific. Indeed, since the 1860s, Russia had been aggressively expanding into its southern borderlands, into Afghanistan and into Persia. The Persian Empire, like China, was a hobbled one and therefore an opportunity for the Russians to expand. Indeed, Persia was being squeezed then between an expanding Russian Empire and the British Empire based in India, two aggressive superpowers, in a sense, bearing down on the Persian state, leading to something called the Great Game, made famous in, yes, Rudyard Kipling's famous novel of 1901 called Kim. Both struggling for supremacy in this region, as the Russians and the British using railroads as a mechanism to penetrate into Persia. And eventually not just railroads, but soon access to oil and pipelines. This would culminate in the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 and the partition of Persia into two quote-unquote spheres of influence. Now, this helped settle the scores for a time anyway between Britain and Russia, in part because both of them were concerned about German expansion. And nothing better than a rivalry between powers to get some of them to bury the hatchet. Nonetheless, there was a looming tension then between Russia and Japan in the East Asian theater, between two emerging empires then, with a focus on Port Arthur, which was seen as one of the main gateways for the Russians into the Pacific Ocean. Russia, in a sense, imagined itself as a continental power that ran from the Baltic Sea with access to the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, not unlike the United States. And the Tsar personally blessed the start of the Pacific branch of the Trans-Siberian Railroad that would lead to the city of Vladivostok in 1891. So the conflict with Japan seems, at least in retrospect anyway, almost inevitable. Korea had given Russia mining and timber rights, and that angered the Japanese, who wanted exclusive access to Korean resources. And in early 1904, Japanese warships attacked the Russian fleet based in Port Arthur that would spark a war between the Russians and the Japanese. Now, the Japanese knew that they needed to have a swift, decisive victory before reinforcements could arrive to bolster Russian military presence in the Pacific that would come via the Suez Canal. The Baltic fleet then would sail around and could avoid Africa now that the Suez Canal connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean directly. And of course, thanks to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So the Japanese levied a swift and decisive victory, leading to the first modern full-scale naval battle in modern history of the Russian Pacific Fleet was annihilated in one day in May of 1905, losing 8 battleships in one decisive encounter. This was exactly the kind of strike that the Japanese wanted to deliver. And like China, Russia, though it was not an old empire in the way that China was, Russia was deeply humiliated. And it would seek its revenge, I have to say, in the Second World War. And we're going to come back to that later on. So Japan emerges triumphant in the Pacific. Russia and China are left defeated, unstable, with fiscal problems. And we're going to see that one of the effects is going to be a cycle of revolution and reform in both the victims of the Japanese triumphs, in both Russia and in China. So by 1900, the world map has truly changed. In 1776, in the end now we can say, did not roll back empire. Rising nationalism did not spell the end of imperial impulses. Free trade did not put an end to the idea that everybody had to be voluntarily inducted into this global system. And at the same time, this was not a stable order. The world was becoming a crowded place as empires increasingly jostled with each other for supremacy, and capable of transforming the physical landscapes from Java to the Amazon.